Jalen Rose joining us in studio. We'll have him in for a while, which is nice. And you can take part first in this debate that we started early on the program today, and I wanted to bring up again here. And there was a column yesterday by Bob Kravitz that was published in USA Today that I thought was very interesting, in which you compared Phil Jackson winning 9 and maybe at this point 10 championships in this era with Red Auerbach winning 9 championships as head coach of the Celtics, basically in the 1960s, in a totally different era of basketball. And Kravitz is trying to make the argument that this makes Jackson, if he wins the 10th, he becomes the greatest coach of all time, if he isn't already, because it is more difficult to win consistently now with all the different factors there are, with players changing teams all the time. Yes, your core stays the same, but all your other role players and things like that are constantly changing, and there are other factors and pressures and all the rest of that. And I have my thoughts sort of pro and con, but right off the top, your thoughts, Jalen Rose, if Phil Jackson wins, is he the greatest coach of all time?
He has to be. If you're looking at it from an unbiased sense, how can he not be? I have a lot of respect for Red Auerbach and what he's done, winning his 9 championships. As you mentioned, it was a different era. It was less teams, it was less free agency, and it seemed like 80% of the Hall of Famers that existed in the NBA were actually on Red's team. Yeah. So from that actually helps you win a couple of championships. So a different era, different athletes. The players are bigger, faster, stronger. I think for Phil Jackson to do it in this era, he's coached a couple of the greatest players that we consider in different decades too. Like Kobe Bryant is going to go down as one of the greatest players. So is Shaquille O'Neal, obviously Michael Jordan, obviously Scottie Pippen, and the championships speak for themselves. So if you're unbiased, you have to say yes.
In your mind, who are the greatest coaches? Who's the 5 greatest coaches?
Definitely those 2 gentlemen. I think they have to be right up there. Pat Riley, he has to be up there as all-time great. Chuck Daly. I think he's an all-time great.
You know, I asked that because the list we got, you've just named 4 of the people that were on the list. People throwing in Larry Brown for the fact that he took bad teams and basically saying sometimes it doesn't have to be about number of championships, though that helps. But what do you do with a bad team? And Larry Brown would turn bad teams into good teams.
And I actually played for Larry Brown for 2 teams. I played for him in Indianapolis and I played for him in New York. But it's hard for me to consider him one of the greatest of all time, because he's actually coached 9 or 10 teams.
Yeah.
So you can't, to me, be one of the greatest of all time if one of those teams actually hasn't retired your number, so to speak. You know, he hasn't had the staying power in one situation, the development. And a lot of times to build up a bad situation, guess what you have to do? You have to tear it down first.
Right, yeah.
And he's known for doing that as well. So he is a great coach, and he will come up in the conversation. He definitely deserves to be a Hall of Famer. But an all-time great, absolutely not.
He took the 76ers to the finals. He won a championship with Detroit and went to another final with them. He won a title in the ABA. He won a title on the college level. But purely as a pro coach, it's very difficult to compare that to guys who've won 9 or 10 rings. My view on that is this. Yes, Phil Jackson is an immortal, and here's the argument on his side. Doing it over and over and over again in this era is harder than doing it over and over and over again when Auerbach did it. I agree with that completely because you can keep your team together then, and you can't now. I will say this, though. I think that, as we've seen in all sports, the talent is diluted. You know, in those days, maybe there weren't as many great basketball players walking the planet in 1965 as there are in 2009. But there were only 16 teams or something like that. I think the teams were better then than the teams are now.
There was a time when there was about 8 or 9 teams as well where they got a few championships.
We'd have to look back and see. Paul Card, get me that. How many teams were there in the NBA at the time that Auerbach was winning most of his rings? Because, you know, there were teams that would have, like Bob Picozzi brought up, the Cincinnati Royals had 3 Hall of Famers on their team. They never got out of the Eastern Conference. They had Jerry Lucas and Oscar Robertson and Jack Twyman. And there were others. I even think as late as the 70s and the 80s, the teams that didn't win had better players. The Milwaukee Bucks teams that I grew up with, that Don Nelson coached, were great teams. They never got out of the second round, I don't think, because they had to go up against Dr. J or Larry Bird. There were 9 teams in the NBA in Reds last year. I said it's even less than I thought. Red Auerbach's last year, there were 9 teams.
And it's 30 now, Greeny.
That's what I mean.
And LeBron James at 6'8", 260 then would be a center.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not in any way comparing the talent.
Yeah.
These teams would destroy those teams just on physicality alone. But I do think on an individual basis relative to era, it's actually harder to be the best of 9 teams every year than it is to be the best of 30. Because if you have 2 really good players, most teams now don't. Most teams now, if they're lucky, have one really good player. In those days, the bad teams had 2 all-time great players. You know what I'm saying? Because
Yeah,
there were
what you're
only
saying.
9 teams in the entire NBA.
But when you have 30 teams, you have more room for error.
Yeah.
And you have more great players, more bad matchups, a lot of different situations. When it's only 9 teams, you have 2 teams going against each other. After that series, it's only 4 teams left. So it's less room for error to win a championship. Now you have 3 rounds. You have the first round, you have the second round, then you have the conference finals, then you have the NBA finals. That's a lot of room for error.
It is.
A lot of great players.
It is. It's a great debate.
The
It's an
debate
absolutely
rages
great
on.
debate.
Quickly, Bob in Ohio says Red built the Celtics and won. Phil adopted his teams and won. So he gives a nod to Red. It's a fun debate on both sides.
But you know what? Whether it's Phil Jackson, whether it's Kobe Bryant, the historians of the game appreciate what these guys are actually doing now. A lot of naysayers point to the great players that they played with. That's a part of it. Okay, Red Auerbach coached Bill Russell.
Right,
he was
great
pretty
players.
good.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
he had Hall of Famers up and down his roster. That's what a great coach does. He develops Shaquille O'Neal into one of the all-time greats. He helps develop Michael Jordan into one of the all-time greats. That's what greatness is. So don't get on Phil because of the great players that he's had or the great teams he's had, because he's developed them into that.
I yelled at people earlier for that, too.
Mike,
I agree with you.
Mike, yeah, go back over history and find the coaches who've won multiple titles with talent like me on their roster.
Yeah.
You're not going to find many. By the way, if you go to the Mike and Mike page at ESPNRadio.com right now, you can vote on our poll question. The question is simply this: if Phil wins his 10th NBA title, is he the greatest coach of all time? Yes or no? Log on to vote. And remind you also, you can listen to ESPN Radio Sports Center updates, the best podcasts, including the best of Mike and Mike and the BS Report with Bill Simmons, and much more anytime, anywhere, on any mobile device. Visit ESPNRadio.com on your mobile phone or BlackBerry today. No subscription or data plan are required. Jalen Rose stays with us. We'll break down tonight's Game 4 of the NBA Finals. Must win for the Magic. How do they do it? Jalen tells you next. Mike and Mike in the morning.
ESPN Radio.